my name is Agata. I'm the head of marketing at PictoChart, the all-in-one visual communication tool and the organizer of the Business Storyteller Summit. I'm excited to welcome my Fireside chat guest, Andy Raskin. Andy Raskin helps CEOs align their teams around a strategic narrative. His clients include leadership teams at Salesforce, Square, Dropbox, IBM, Uber, and Yelp, as well as dozens of venture-backed technology companies. His 2016 post, "The Greatest Sales Decks I Have Ever Seen," got over 2.5 million views and has been embraced worldwide as a new framework for company positioning and category definition. His own stories have appeared on NPR's This American Life and All Things Considered, as well as in the New York Times, Wired, and Gourmet. Welcome, Andy, and thank you for joining us at the Business Storyteller Summit.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Agata.
We are really happy to have you here. So the topic of this conversation is story is strategy. Could you tell us a bit more why creating a story around one's business strategy is so crucial?
Yeah, when I was younger, I used to think that the story was kind of like wrapping paper for the product. Like, you build this product and then, we're going to create this story that's going to like make it look good on the shelf, like a packaging. And through lots of experiences, I came to this kind of almost flipped view, which is that actually the story is kind of the main thing we're building. And the product is kind of like a prop for making the story come true. So in a way, like, and when I work with, very important prop, but when I work with teams, this is something I hear over and over, is that the story wasn't just like, for selling, although of course that's often the first impetus, but it becomes this kind of strategic North Star that guides like the product team on what we're even building. And so that's why I really believe this thing that the story is the strategy.
That's really interesting to think from this perspective as well. And I think like that should shift the way CEOs are also thinking about it. And actually related to this, when I hear the term strategic narrative, I immediately think of Andy Raskin. So it seems that strategic narrative was rather an underinvested skill among the leaders in the past. I mean, obviously it existed before you, right? But not that many people talked about it, and you actually helped to popularize it as one of the top skills that founders and CEOs should develop. And how can founders work on improving in this area, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, I think we should get clear on what we mean by it. Like, how do we even define it? And really, it's like taken me years to even like to have a definition that I'm really comfortable with. And the way I like to think about it is that a strategic narrative is the story in a person's head that guides their actions and their decisions. So all of us, when we're going around in the world, we have a strategic narrative in our head that is, you reached out to me and others to do this conference, and this is, these actions are guided by some story in your head about like how to thrive. And buyers have a story in their head that is going to, guides what they think is urgent, what problems they're going to address. In fact, I'd say even nothing is a problem until you have a story about the world, and then something is getting in your way for somewhere you want to get. So the strategic narrative, I think a lot of people think it means, well, how are we going to talk about our company in a really exciting way? And I like to flip it. And the starting point, I think, so you asked, how can people get better at this? I think the starting point is, well, what's the story in people's heads right now that is leading them to sort of not feel urgency about the thing we're pitching? And what's the story in our heads that not about us, but about the world that we feel differently, and maybe some of our early buyers are feeling differently? And how can we get that story into their heads? So it's not a story about us, but a story about the world and how it has changed.
Yeah, I think the problem is as well that sometimes it might be difficult to identify. So to some founders, they might think like, oh, I don't have any interesting story to tell, because they don't really think about their own journey, why they wanted to launch this particular product or service, right? And they think like, oh, I don't have anything that I could use as a story. So, like, do you have some best practices, how you could identify it?
Well, first of all, like the strategic narrative I'm talking about is not necessarily like the founding story. It's not, I'm not talking about, um, you know, recounting your founder journey. Although sometimes that can be part of conveying it.
Mhm.
You founded this company because you saw some opportunity in the world.
Mm.
And this opportunity, like, it didn't come from nowhere. Like, something had to have happened for this to for this opportunity to arise. And that is the story. I think not literally like your why you founded the company, but what has happened in the world that has changed the world for the potential buyers, where this thing you're bringing them is so valuable now, even more valuable than it might have been in the past. So you asked best practices. One of the things that I always do with teams is I have them talk to their customers about this stuff, and to try and elicit the story. And the questions, a lot of teams talk to customers, but we're typically asking things like, well, what do you love about our product? What do you hate about our product? Why'd you buy it? And what I'm interested in is less that and more, what has changed in your world such that what we're giving to you, what you got from us, is so much more valuable now than it would have been a few years ago, or some short time ago, and get them talking about what has shifted in their world. And often this is some leads to some fertile territory for where the story can start.
I love it that you mentioned it, because I'm also a huge advocate of talking to customers, and I feel that it's often undervalued. People think that it's only like the area of customer success or customer support. And actually, like, every person in the company should have some sort of a touch point with the customer, probably as well, to understand. And especially CEOs, right? Like, they should be talking on a regular basis with their customers as well.
Absolutely.
And what are the most important elements of an effective strategic narrative? It's not just like this founding story, but obviously also like you need to communicate the change within the company. You need to align the whole team around your strategy. What are the important elements that CEOs should pay attention to, CEOs and leaders?
Well, I think the biggest one is centering it around a shift in the world. So what I've been calling the old game and the new game. So one example of this, you mentioned that post about Zuora, the greatest sales deck I've ever seen. So Zuora tells this story. Hey, we used to be in a world where we wanted to own things. So one-off transactions, people wanted to just, people would buy things, and if you played that game as a seller, that was very successful. It was a great game. Like, you just sell things.
Mhm.
Uh, but the world changed, whether because of, technology, just people's taste, whatever. A lot of things happen, and now we're in a new world where people don't necessarily want to buy a lot of things. They want the benefits of those things without the hassles of the ownership. Zuora calls this usership, or sometimes they call it the subscription economy. And so this story about this shift in the world is the kind of cornerstone of all Zuora's communication. I mean, every blog post, every sales pitch, every time the CEO talks on TV, this is the starting point. The starting point is not, let me tell you about Zuora. It's not even, let me tell you about the problem we solve. Because there's many problems. Every company solves many problems. And problems are not problems, like I said, until there's a sort of goal state that we want to get to. So the most fundamental piece is this. Then we want to show that there are stakes, that this new game, that if you don't play it, basically you're on the road to ruin. And so we need to show that there are the people who are not getting on board are dying, and vice versa, the people who are winning. So that there's basically this new game is creating new winners and losers. Mm-hmm. And once we've done that, then we want to get really clear on what I call the object of the new game, which is, okay, so there's this new world called subscription economy. What is it? What is the finish line? Where do I have to get to to win in this world? Like what's the finish line? And Zuora defines that as, at least initially, they defined it as, you have to deliver this thing they call the subscription experience, which had all these components. If you can do that, then you win. Of course, then we want to talk about, well, what's going to stop you from getting to that goal? So basically now these problems, but now the problems are not just problems, they're really obstacles to getting to this goal. And of course, now we can talk about how we are the only ones really thinking about the world this way, and then therefore, we uniquely are positioned to help you get to that finish line.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm glad as well that you mentioned the Zuora post, because we actually got quite a lot of questions from our attendees around this, like about building sales pitch decks and also investment decks. So I wanted also, I know that you mentioned the elements already, but what would be some additional maybe tips for people to create an impressive pitch deck? What would you recommend?
By pitch deck, do you mean investor deck?
So let's start maybe with the sales pitch deck, and then we can go to the investor one.
Yeah, so I think I went through the main pieces of the sales deck. The only other piece I'd add is just some evidence that you are making this story come true. Which is basically success stories about how you've helped people get to that, reach that object of the game and win. Mm-hmm. For the investor pitch, I actually don't usually get involved with teams on investor pitches. Usually that's not the trigger for me to come in. It's usually they've usually raised the money and now they're looking to grow and realizing, wow, if we could kind of really nail this story, it's going to kind of be a multiplier on all our investments on the ROI for investments in marketing and sales. Investor pitches are interesting because investors are really idiosyncratic in what they want, the way they even expect the pitch to be. I mean, there are some investors who will say, I only want a pitch that starts with the problem slide and then the solution slide. And, so then it's sort of up to you whether you want to veer away from that at your own risk. But in general, the core of the investor pitch is still the sales pitch. Mm-hmm. Because what does the investor want to know? What's the first call that an investor is going to make if they're interested for due diligence? They're going to call a customer and they're going to say, well, why did you buy this? They're going to want to know what is so appealing about this. Why do customers want this? And so that, I think, means that the core of the sales deck really becomes the core of the investor deck. Of course, there's a lot of other things in investor deck that are not in a sales deck, like how is how is each sale going to create profit? So basically like revenue and profit model, business model. And then, are there, how many of these customers are there and how much money do they have to spend? So at kind of TAM, there's the team stuff, which isn't necessarily in the sales deck. So there's other pieces you need, but the core of it, I think, is the same. And of course, what's one of the big objections that investors typically have? It's, well, why isn't, or sort of doubts they have is, well, why isn't anyone else doing this? Isn't somebody else doing this or whatever? And by starting with a shift in the world, I think you help them smell the opportunity because you're saying, hey, you're really starting with the why now. I don't like to label slides why now, but because it's not really saying anything. But by talking about this shift in the world, you're talking about why this opportunity it has arisen. And this, I think, gets their blood hot, and gets them seeing the opportunity.
Yeah, I think these are helpful tips anyways, because a lot of attendees of this Business Storyteller Summit are founders. So we got quite a lot of questions about investor pitches. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you are trying also to sell something, right? Like you are trying to sell this idea to the investors as well. So I think still following the structure that you describe in your post on Medium could be definitely helpful. Maybe like that's something that could be your next post as well, to write about the investor pitches, because maybe not everyone realizes that the sales pitch directions could help them.
Yeah, I did write a post called it's called Why Great Pitches, it's called Great Pitches Start with Change. And that post goes a little more into this change, and it has an example of how this change is used in an investor deck. It's a company called Amplitude, where they pitched their Series C deck and they put it out there, and they talked about, it was the shift they mentioned is now every product is digital, or every product is software, something like that. And so Amplitude sells software for measuring and measuring how users are using the software. And so this shift is really, creating the case that there's just this huge market now for their stuff. So that's one post. I've been a little hesitant to dive too much into giving advice for investor pitches, for that reason that investors can be really picky about how exactly they want it. And I don't want to be responsible for telling somebody, oh, you should structure it this way, and then the investors, no, I hate that way. Sales is a little different because I think you can have a structure that can work over sort of lots and lots of people you'll be talking to over years.
But overall, you think as well that like the element of the story could definitely help, right? Like when pitching for investment as well.
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, the core of that deck is still the sales story. It's still the same thing.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you so much. And what are the biggest mistakes that CEOs do when it comes to business storytelling? That, I don't know, from your experience, you have worked with so many CEOs. What have you noticed as well?
Well, I think, I can tell you one of the mistakes I made when I first started doing this was, so sometimes teams would contact me and they would say, I'll be running the project. Maybe it was like the VP of marketing would say, hey, I'll be running this and I want to work with you. And I'll keep our CEO posted on what we're doing, and we'll have him or her sign off at the end. And a few years into it, I looked at like what were the teams where I worked with them, and it really seemed to go great. And we're the ones where it was sort of, I didn't really see the story embraced as much. And it was always where the CEO was actually leading it and like fully in there with me in the trenches all the time. And so I think one of the big, people think, I guess, because story, a strategic narrative sounds like words, so sounds like marketing. And I really see this, if it's strategy, if the story is strategy, then this is CEO work. And so I think one of the big things is that this, where I've seen this done successfully, like the CEO leads it and takes it on as their thing. Um, and uh, and in my work, I decided like I'm only going to work with teams where that's the case. So I lose a lot of work because of that, because that's still, I think, a minority view. And I'm often contacted by marketing teams or others who say, "Hey, we're running this project, not the CEO." And maybe it would be fine, but I just decided like I'm gonna just work with the CEO because that seemed to be the most successful model for me.
I think it completely makes sense as well, especially if you think about it that, it doesn't apply just for the message that you are sending out, right? But it applies to every single department within your company. So it applies to the product, like if the product will follow the strategy, then also like the customers will be happy. So every single department would need to be involved. So it doesn't really make sense that marketing would own it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways to look at what people call business storytelling, and I'm guessing some of the people you might have talk are talking about this one way where it's a kind of approach to communication where it's like we're going to use stories to be more effective communicators in many different kind of situations and many different kinds of stories, and that's totally valid. It's not my interest though. My interest is what is the one story that we're all telling all the time, that one that becomes the strategy. And that to me, like that's gotta come from the leader.
Yeah. In order for it to stick and that people will actually repeat it, right? And buy into the story as well. Makes sense. And from your experience working with the CEOs, what are usually the most surprising outcomes that the CEOs notice after they start working with you on their strategic and narrative as well?
Well, some of the early things I hear are, some teams really track like sales cycle,
Mhm.
and I've heard from some teams, uh, like there was one team, it's called Logical. They do SaaS platform for legal teams, and Andy Wilson, the CEO of that company, told me that in a couple of months right after we worked together and they started deploying this narrative, he tracked something called time to first win. So the time it takes for a new salesperson to close a new deal, their first deal.
Mhm.
And that went from like 60 days to less than 30 days. So he saw this huge increase in the speed at which the reps were getting activated. And I've heard kind of similar sales cycle duration things happen, and that's happened for me in my own experience when I was part of teams. But I think the bigger thing that I hear from CEOs is that it just becomes this North Star for everything. And the big one is product evolution.
Mhm.
That we just started with thinking, oh, this was going to be about sales. And it became really clear as we're building this narrative, wow, this is actually creating a roadmap for us. And I first had that experience with a team where the head of product had come from Google. And at first he was like, why am I participating in this exercise? Because this seems like a sales and marketing thing. And by the end of it, he was like, Andy, this story is now how I manage the prioritization of my backlog. So which features we're going to build first. He then became a CEO of a company, and then I worked with their team,
Mhm.
and with them, it was like pretty early on. They hadn't even built out much of the product yet, but he wanted to do this because he was like, yes, this is how we're going to know what to build. And that kind of stuff I just find really gratifying and really interesting.
Yeah, I'm also glad that you mentioned product, because we actually received one of the questions from our attendees that is related to this. He's a brand manager. He asked how to create an actionable plan on taking the founder's story and applying our voice to it through product and content.
Yeah, so again, like the founder's story is often makes sense if the founder is telling it. So when the team is small, it makes a lot of sense that the founder is in all the sales calls and telling, that story about how they founded the company. And often that is related to the strategic narrative because they probably experience this shift in the world themselves and they can kind of talk to it personally. I think when we're talking about the broader context, the founder story and the strategic narrative are not necessarily the same, or at least like the strategic narrative has to be sometimes teased out of that founder story so that it's something where it's not really about the founder anymore. It's about the customer and their world. And I think that's really the first step to first pull that out. And of course, I think this is the job of the leader to do first for the team, not to place that burden on the team. And then if the leader can do that, then it should be pretty clear for whether it's the brand manager I think you talked about, or the product team, or whoever, to then apply this as their North Star. It's not always so clear if it's just sort of, here's what happened to me as a founder.
I think also, like, not some people are really good in storytelling, right? Like it's a skill as well. So even if, let's say, you have it done, like you did the majority of the work, like you already know what is going to be your North Star story. Sometimes it might be that, like, even if you have the most amazing deck, like maybe like some documentation, like video around it, or whatever, it comes down to the delivery, and not everyone, like some people are great at it and the others are not that good. Do you also help CEOs with this aspect of, like, storytelling itself? Are there some things that you recommend for them? Because obviously this is a skill that you can practice as well.
Well, one of we're all humans, and I think we all have the ability to tell a story. We may not have the ability to, like, write a movie or give a thrilling presentation in front of a large crowd, but I think we all have the ability to do like a 30-second story about the world. And so I really try to just boil it down so compactly so that it's not about the performance. I mean, maybe you'll have also other people talking in this conference about how to present and all that kind of stuff. I'm completely not interested in that. No, I wouldn't say that. I've actually taken workshops about learning how to present, and I found them hugely helpful. So I shouldn't say that. I'd say my work is not about that, because I don't, like you said, like I don't want it to be about whether somebody is a great presenter or not. One of my one of the best examples, I think, is Elon Musk. Look at his pitch, especially early on. His style is really horrible. I mean, he gets a little bit of an Elon Musk pass because he's Elon Musk.
Yeah,
but
it's also difficult to interview him because his responses are usually very short.
Yeah, but then he did this pitch for the Powerwall, which is Tesla's unit that commercialized their battery technology. Mm-hmm. And again, this pitch was not stylistically very good. Like, he's doing the ums and the ahs and all his normal stuff, but just the structure of it is so good that he suddenly became hailed as like the next Steve Jobs. His next pitch for the Model X was horrible and not structured well, and so I don't know, that person, whoever helped him or whatever, was on vacation, or he wasn't up to it somehow. But to me, if we structure it properly, that's like 99% of the work in order to get it to flow through the company. And we shouldn't have to rely on presentation.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So basically, like you can also then once you have the structure, you can script it as well, right? Like if let's say I don't know someone is very stressed out when they have to like go out and talk to the whole company, um, that should help them as well.
And this is, you're getting to, well, yeah, what's the format that we even put this thing in? Like when we talk about like writing down the narrative or getting clear on the narrative, what's the instrument we have that we're writing it down in? And most of in my career, like I was taught, put it in a place that the world doesn't see. So it's going to be like a positioning statement or some kind of like collection of messages, some like kind of messaging structure document that is internal, that we're supposed to kind of like the DNA, and we're going to kind of come to it. And when we do have to express the narrative, we're going to use that as our guide. So if we want to build a sales deck, we've looked at maybe take some of the messages out of it. If we want to build a website, we're going to take the key messages out of it. If we want to do a talk. And what I found in my career was like, that didn't really happen. Like, okay, maybe marketing would usually build this thing, and then marketing becomes the cop to try to get everyone else to use that same messages. And also these messages are not in really a kind of narrative format. So it's not really clear how to take just sort of these messages and then make them flow in, say, a sales deck or on a website or whatever. So when I started doing this work, I really thought hard about like what would be a kind of guide that would work better this way. And I came to the sales deck. So when I work with teams, the sales deck is almost always the thing we're building, because it gives people a guide on how to tell the story very quickly, and in the most important context that matters. It also has the effect of course, we're going to test it in sales calls. So sales is going to be very involved in building it. And so they're less likely to kind of reject it as something that marketing, threw at them or the CEO threw at them.
I'm so happy you mentioned the format aspect, because often like people get so caught up into thinking like, okay, in which format should I present it, that they spend more time thinking about the format than the actual story. But it's understandable as well, because right now we are surrounded with so many different formats for content as well, that it makes it a bit hard to decide. So it's good that you mentioned, like, from your experience, that you noticed that actually like an actual presentation, sales presentation would be the best like starting point, where you can then later repurpose this message from the presentation into other formats maybe.
Yeah, have you done that? I'm just curious, like it.
Yeah, in our case, yes, we have it as well, because actually Pictochart is, we also offer presentations as a format, so we do templates that are around this as well. So in our case, it is also like this, but it's often also like we make sure that the CEO on a regular basis communicates this to the team and emphasizes the whole story, like why we are doing this, what we are doing, on and on and on, right? Like, so it sticks in people's minds across all the teams.
Great.
Yeah. And one of the first things that majority of startup founders do is positioning. There's a lot of questions around startup founders because of the audience of the Business Storyteller Summit, so bear with me. But they analyze the market, they look at their competition, define their buyer personas, and they think about their pricing model. And in your opinion, what should come first, positioning or narrative?
Well, this is a tough question to answer, because I think there's a lot of definitional baggage built up in what does positioning mean, what does narrative mean. I think the traditional approach, just my experience, is positioning is supposed to be kind of like what I said before, this kind of central thing that the world doesn't see it, but it's something, it's like the result of our research, and all the things you mentioned, like the marketing, the pricing research, our ideal customer, and we're going to write it down, and then the strategic narrative is just it's I don't know, some story that we tell, but it better be based on this thing. So that's sort of the traditional way of thinking about it. The other thing about positioning is it's traditionally defined as in relation to competitors. So if you look at the traditional positioning statement, it's always, here's your problem, here's how we solve the problem, and here are our unique differentiators for why we're better. And what that doesn't say anything about urgency. So it doesn't really, if someone doesn't really see they have the problem, or has lots of problems and maybe hasn't prioritized this one, then it really doesn't give you any guide on how to create urgency, drive urgency for that kind of person. And really, we're talking about most buyers we're going to see, right? So I guess I have two issues with that traditional thing. My view is that great, do all this research, whatever you call it market research, and the pricing research, and get to know who your customer is, all this stuff, and boil that all down into the strategic narrative. That the strategic narrative, if we've built it properly, is the best way to express your decisions about the things you mentioned, like who the customer is, all this stuff. So what I would say is strategic narrative is positioning, and that I think it's the ideal format to, and again, sales deck more specifically, to express your positioning decisions. And also that by positioning, we're not only talking about how we're better than competitors. In fact, that's usually not my focus, because I think people are kind of skeptical about claims like that. But the bigger focus is why is the status quo narrative a road to ruin? And that's really the focus. That's, I think, the more important focus. Talk to salespeople, or even early stage founders, when they lose deals. What's the biggest reason? It's not competitors. It's that the company just did nothing. They didn't see it as urgent.
Yeah, that definitely happens. I noticed it as well. Related to this as well, another question, because we got this question from the audience in terms of convincing the CEO about the importance of having a strategy and building a strategic narrative. And you mentioned as well earlier that in the past, you saw it, that this is the most effective when the CEO is involved. But do you have any suggestions, when, let's say, the team is really driven, and let's say someone from marketing writes to you or someone from sales writes to you that they would want to work on this aspect, they even have the budget and so on, but the CEO thinks that he should not be involved? Do you help them to somehow convince the CEO? Do you give them some tips? Or maybe you could share some tips as well, how to convince the CEO of the importance that he has to be at the center of it as well.
So I gave up a long time ago trying to, I don't know if I ever really tried it, but I think I just realized wow, that is a losing battle. And for sure, the number of CEOs who really believe what I believe, which is that they have to be in the trenches building this thing, is definitely a minority. And I've been very lucky that there are enough in that minority that it's been, you know, enough of a career for me. When VPs of marketing contact me, there's usually two reactions. One, when I mention this, and I'd say maybe 8 or 9 out of 10, get kind of pissed off and like, hey, this is my project. I'm running this. This, you know, I'm marketing. The story falls under my purview. And I totally get that. I feel like I would feel like that maybe if I was running marketing, right? And then there's this other reaction I get. And there was this VP of marketing who I spoke with just recently, and she said, yes, please, like if you can get my CEO, if my CEO will commit to the story, then I can do my job. So she really saw this as like, you know, of course, when I work with teams, I try to balance it between the CEO leading it and working with me on actually building it, but balancing that with the team. So the VP marketing and heads of other functional areas all participating in the work and guiding it. So it is a balance. I'm not saying I don't want the VPs marketing involved. They have to be involved and they play a huge role. So then often this person will ask me, well, so how do I make that case? And I say, you know, probably it's not going to happen, because I think it really has to come from them. Where I have seen it happen, in the few cases it happened, the VP marketing or some other exec who wanted to sell the idea up just shared some things. Sometimes it was that post, like that Zuora post, or some other things I wrote, or other things other people wrote maybe, and say, hey, this resonated with me. What do you think? And there have been some cases where then the CEO said, wow, yeah, I want this, and they've reached out to me. But I think it's a really hard one, and I'm sorry that I don't have any better advice for how to do that.
But I think this point that you mentioned as well, that like, you know, there's these two different groups, and some of them become very defensive, and the other ones there say, yeah, you are right. I think that's already a good starting point, because, you know, obviously if you're a VP of marketing or VP of sales, you have some sort of a, you know, influence as well, right? Like you were hired for a reason on this higher level position. So I think that's a good starting point where you can convince as well the CEO, and like be very open and transparent and tell them like, you know, I need you on board there, because otherwise we cannot do it without you as well. And I mean, if it's not going to help, then probably you need to change your job.
I wasn't going to say it, so I'm glad you did, Agata. I didn't want to be so harsh to your attendees. But yeah, I think, you know, don't you want to be working for a CEO who feels that this is their job?
I think we have to be harsh, because a lot of attendees are founders, and I think they have to realize how important it is as well, you know, and that often like they become the blockers as well. So I think it's important to be harsh, that like, you know, it impacts as well, like, because that's ultimately gonna also commit to the success of the company later on.
Totally. Yeah, for sure.
That was my last question, Andy. It was a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing the knowledge with the audience of the Business Storyteller Summit. And
it was so great talking with you, Agata, too. And whenever I need someone to be that harsh voice that I can't quite say, now I know who I can call on. So thank you.
Definitely, I can post comments under your LinkedIn post.
The voice of honest, hard truth, tough love. Thank you.
And to everyone who wants to learn more, I recommend checking your content on Medium. Very good posts, like, you know, I've been a fan myself as well. And following you on LinkedIn and Twitter, you share actually a lot of really useful insights from working with your clients there. So I think like people can definitely follow you. and check your website as well, right? Like if they manage to convince the CEO, then they should definitely reach out to you and maybe work with you as well.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thanks.
Great talking with you, Agata.
Thank you. Bye.